Hello there, hola, and welcome to another Spanish GCSE and iGCSE video tutorial. And in this particular tutorial, we're going through a tricky and advanced element of Spanish grammar, which is the subjunctive. So we're going to look first at how the subjunctive is actually used, what it even is in the first place, before going on to how to form a subjunctive in the two key or most common subjunctive tenses. So, firstly, my name's Dhananjay Talwar. Just to introduce myself briefly, I studied French and Italian for my MA at the University of Cambridge before picking up Spanish separately as well and practicing considerably. And I graduated from Cambridge back in 2015, and I've been in the field of education since that time. And I've spent the last 6 years, at least, as a full time tutor. As a full time tutor, I've helped more than 500 different students achieve or exceed their target grade in languages for GCSE or iGCSE exams. And that's mainly for French and Spanish because of the higher demand in the UK for those languages. But I have helped students for a variety of other languages as well. I've taught 8 of them overall to GCSE and iGCSE level, and several of those at much higher levels too. So yeah, it's been a very rewarding experience. I now work with a wide range of other tutors too, over 150 actually, at my tutoring agency called Threshold Education. Together, we cover all of the subjects between us and all levels. And I myself have also helped students to gain entrance to schools, including top UK schools like Eton, Westminster, St. Paul's, and more, and universities, including top universities such as Oxford, Cambridge, and others as well. Although here I specialize in languages and I'm the languages lead. And that is also largely because I'm hugely passionate about languages and language learning. I've learned more than 20 languages myself to different levels, at least 9 of those to fluency. It's something that I continue to do. It's a real hobby and passion of mine, of course. And I love motivating others to learn languages, telling them of the benefits of doing so, and ultimately making sure they know how to do so and how to reach their goals, which is often a target grade in an exam such as GCSE or iGCSE. So that's a bit about me and my background. This is just an overview of the Spanish GCSE and iGCSE exam boards, 4 of them for GCSE Spanish and 2 for iGCSE Spanish. And now let's dive into the subjunctive itself. So the subjunctive is actually a very tricky aspect of Spanish grammar for many students. Some students, depending on what grade you're aiming for, whether you're doing foundation tier or higher tier as well, and the school that you're at, of course, you may not even encounter or come across the subjunctive. You may not learn it at school for GCSE and iGCSE as part of the Spanish GCSE and iGCSE course. The subjunctive is commonly used. It's used a lot, actually, by Spanish speakers in everyday conversations when they're speaking. So it is an important part of Spanish grammar. But for GCSE and iGCSE, definitely not all students would learn it. And if you're finding it tough or difficult to get your head around, which firstly is going to be the case for many students, actually, then there are perhaps alternatives like memorizing key phrases, which I'll come on to later as well. The first thing to know, though, is that the subjunctive is not actually a tense. And that in itself can be something that's quite difficult for people to get their head around. The subjunctive is not a tense. It's actually what's called a mood instead. That's because the subjunctive doesn't tell you when exactly something happened. A tense indicates when something happened or happens or is happening or will happen. And the tenses could generally be roughly split into past, present, and future. Very roughly. You can get various past and future tenses, though, as well, and so on. But a mood, on the other hand, a mood reflects or indicates or shows the speaker's attitude towards the events described, rather than when those events happened or are going to happen. So it doesn't reflect just the time, it's more the attitude of the speaker towards the events that they're describing. So the subjunctive is a mood. A mood is also a much more overarching and wider category than a tense, because a mood can have several tenses. And all of the tenses that you would have generally learned before you learn the subjunctive. So most people would start off with the present tense in school. Then they might go into the future, imperfect, preterite, and so on. All of those tenses were in what's called the indicative mood. That is the other mood, apart from the subjunctive mood. It's called the indicative mood. So there are two moods in Spanish. The indicative mood, generally everything you'd have learned up till now, all the tenses that you've learned, all the verb tenses you've learned up till now would have been in the indicative mood. But there is also a subjunctive mood that exists in Spanish as well. And because the subjunctive is a mood, you can have more than one tense within that mood. Just like in the indicative, you have the present, or it would be called the present indicative to give it its full name, the future indicative, imperfect indicative, preterite indicative, and so on. The subjunctive can also have different tenses. It doesn't have a full array of tenses like in the indicative mood, like there are in the indicative mood, but there are a few different tenses found in the subjunctive mood in Spanish still. The two main ones, which we're going to go through and look at in more detail today, are the present subjunctive tense and the imperfect subjunctive tense. So again, present, imperfect, those are tenses, whereas the subjunctive is the mood instead, which is a wider category. There are other, well, there is perhaps one other tense that you could find in the subjunctive in Spanish as well, which is the perfect subjunctive. However, we're not actually covering that here, and it is potentially actually easier to form, as you would simply put the verb, you would form it as you would for the perfect indicative tense, but instead of putting the verb haber, the auxiliary verb haber, in the present indicative, you'd put it in the present subjunctive instead. But we're going to focus on the present subjunctive and imperfect subjunctive here, which you'll come across more commonly. The subjunctive is one of the hardest parts of grammar for Spanish GCSE and iGCSE. So if you're finding it overwhelming or tricky or difficult to understand, that is normal and expected to some extent. And it does, of course, normally take quite a bit of practice. Often it's not forming the subjunctive, which is necessarily the hardest part for students. It's understanding when it's actually used. If you're able to use it correctly in your speaking or writing papers, it can come across as something really impressive to the examiners, because grammatically, the subjunctive is perhaps the most impressive of all of Spanish grammar because of its difficulty in usage and potentially formation as well. So you can definitely use it as a key phrase or a wow phrase as well, providing you can do so correctly. Okay, so when do you actually use the subjunctive? This is something many students find tricky. So we're going to go through this in a little bit of depth. There are certain instances where the subjunctive is triggered. You'll notice that all of these they indicate the speaker's attitude towards the events that they're talking about, rather than when the event itself actually happened, rather than the tense specifically. So when you're expressing doubt, for example, a phrase like dudo que, meaning I doubt that, would be followed by the subjunctive in Spanish. So you'd say dudo que sepa la respuesta, I doubt he knows the answer, rather than dudo que sabe la respuesta. Sepa is a slightly irregular subjunctive, present subjunctive form from the verb saber, one of the verbs meaning to know in Spanish. But the important thing here is that dudo que, anything that comes after dudo que, or the main verb, the conjugated verb following the introductory, the introductory phrase dudo que, must go in the subjunctive form. If you say dudo que sabe la respuesta, technically that is incorrect. If you're expressing doubt in this way, you must use the subjunctive rather than the indicative mood. When you're expressing urgency or necessity, likewise, you should use the subjunctive too. For example, after a phrase like es importante que, you'd say es importante que hagamos nuestros deberes. It is important that we do our homework, or it's important for us to do our homework, potentially in English too, rather than es importante que hacemos nuestros deberes. Hagamos is the present subjunctive from hacer in the nosotros form. And similarly, for other similar expressions like es necesario que, es inevitable que, es urgente que, and so on, all of those would take the subjunctive in Spanish as well. And the verb that follows should go, the main verb that follows should go in the subjunctive, not the indicative mood. So after all of these triggers, the verb afterwards has to go in the subjunctive technically, and not the indicative. Otherwise, it is technically wrong. When you're expressing a wish or desire, again, that takes the subjunctive. Quisiera que is one example, meaning I'd like to. Quisiera que vengas a la fiesta. I would like you to come to the party. Vengas is a present subjunctive form from the verb venir. If you say quisiera que vienes a la fiesta, it does sound incorrect in Spanish, and you could technically be marked down as well. Technically, it's a mistake. Likewise, when expressing emotions, for example, I'm happy that, estoy contento de que, or estoy contenta de que, if the speaker is a girl, would take the subjunctive. So estoy contento o contenta de que aprendas el francés. Aprendas is the present subjunctive, a regular present subjunctive, actually, of the verb aprender, to learn. And that translates as I'm happy that you are learning French. And when expressing possibility, for example, with the phrase es posible que, likewise, you have to use the subjunctive afterwards, not the indicative. So you'd say es posible que sea demasiado tarde instead of es posible que es demasiado tarde. Sea is the present subjunctive of the verb ser, which means, and this sentence means, it's possible that it's too late. Because you're expressing a possibility, something that certainly is not very clear or definite, you have to use the subjunctive. Likewise with similar phrases like es probable que, and so on, and many others too. Also, when you're expressing purpose, you should use the subjunctive too. Para que, meaning in order to, is one example, or so that. For example, he terminado tu trabajo para que puedas descansar, meaning I finished your work, or I have finished your work actually here, so that you can relax. Very sweet. But more importantly, para que is followed by the present subjunctive. Here, puedas is the present subjunctive of the verb poder. And there are various other triggers which don't fit into these neat categories necessarily either, too. And one example of this is aunque, which means although. That's always followed by a subjunctive form. So you'd say, aunque tengan muchos problemas, están contentos, which means even though they have many problems, they are happy. It's usually followed by the subjunctive form aunque, unless you're indicating something that is very definite or certain. There are various other triggers that fall into each of these categories, and other triggers that fall outside that don't fit into any of these categories as well. Those are, of course, unfortunately more difficult because they just have to be memorized and learned. But yeah, the subjunctive does normally take a fair amount of practice. It is possible to learn those other triggers, though, with time and practice as well. Other triggers could include ojalá, for example, if only, or I wish, essentially. And various others as well. Okay, so a few more notes, a few more things to note on the subjunctive. As I said, it is arguably the trickiest aspect of Spanish grammar for most students. So the subjunctive can never actually be used if there's no change in the subject. And when I say the subject, what I mean is the person or thing that's doing the action of the verb. So I'll give you examples here to illustrate and make it clearer. If you were to say, I want to go to Spain, in Spanish, you would use the infinitive, not the subjunctive. So you'd say, quiero ir a España. Quiero ir a España uses the infinitive. Ir is the infinitive of the verb to be, rather than the subjunctive form. And the reason why you don't use the subjunctive here is because the subject of the verb want is I, and the subject of the verb going is also I. In other words, you're saying that I want to go to Spain myself. I want myself to go to Spain. So there's no change in subject at all. And for that reason, you'd stick with the infinitive, ir, rather than any subjunctive form. You don't use the subjunctive at all when there's no change in subject. On the other hand, if you were saying, I want you to go to Spain, that would definitely take the subjunctive form. You'd have to say, quiero que tú vayas a España, or quiero que vayas a España. Vayas, in bold here, is the present subjunctive of the verb ir. Again, quite irregular. The reason why you use the subjunctive in the second example, unlike the first, is because I am the one who wants, who's doing the wanting, but you are the one who would go to Spain. So there's a change in subject. The subject of the first verb is I. The subject of the second verb, though, is different. It's you instead. I don't want myself to go to Spain. I want someone else to go to Spain. And in all of those cases, you'd use the subjunctive instead of the infinitive. That's something that really takes getting used to usually as well, and just practice to not forget this rule as well. Okay, so we're now going on to the formation. We're going to look at the present subjunctive first, then the imperfect subjunctive. So how can you form the present subjunctive? For regular verbs, you would start off with the yo form, the I form, from the present indicative tense, which is likely for most students the first tense that you ever learned in Spanish. And then you would remove the ending, which is usually just the letter O in Spanish. Not always, but usually it would simply be the letter O. That gives you the stem, the first part of the present subjunctive form. And then you'd add the correct present subjunctive ending, which I'll just show you. These are the lists of present subjunctive endings. So on the left-hand side, we've got the endings for all AR verbs, for regular AR verbs, which are ese, hemos, es, en. For example, if we look at the verb hablar, meaning to speak, you take the yo form of the present tense is hablo, meaning I speak. You take away the ending, the o, and that gives you habl, which is your stem, and then you apply the correct subjunctive ending, present subjunctive ending. If you want the I form, the yo form, that ending would just be the letter e, so it would become hable or yo hable, which is the present subjunctive from hablar. For ER and IR verbs, there's a different set of endings, although luckily the endings are the same for both ER and IR verbs. And those endings are a, as, a, amos, ais, an. So the example I've used here is the verb comer, to eat. Como is the your form of the present indicative, meaning I eat. So we start with that. We remove the ending, which is simply the letter O, and that leaves you with com, C-O-M. And then you would add the correct ending, which is the letter A here, if you want the I form. So it becomes coma or yo coma in the I form of the present subjunctive. So the way I still think of the present subjunctive endings, these are the endings for regular verbs at least. The way I still remember those is I simply think of it as a vowel change. For AR verbs, the main vowel is usually the letter A, but in the present subjunctive, that changes to an E instead. And it's almost the reverse, the opposite for ER and IR verbs. The main vowels for them would usually be, say, A, E, or I, but both of those change to an A instead. And that can be a slightly easier way to remember these present subjunctive endings. Okay, this is a look at 3 regular verbs in the present subjunctive, so one of each type of infinitive. Hablar is a typical AR verb, comer is a typical ER verb, and vivir is an example of an IR verb. All of these 3 are regular verbs, and yeah, I've written them out in the present subjunctive forms just to show how they would go in the present subjunctive. Okay, there are unfortunately many irregular verbs in the present subjunctive too. And these include the following. I think this is a very useful list to have for GCSE and iGCSE. And if you know all these irregular forms, then yeah, that's excellent, essentially, for your GCSE and iGCSE exams. Because again, remember that many students would not learn or master the subjunctive at all by the time the GCSE and iGCSE exams come around. And it is one of the hardest aspects of Spanish grammar that often wows examiners at this level. So these irregular verbs include ser, estar, tener, ir, saber, andar. There are potentially other ones to know too, but for GCSE and iGCSE purposes, I think this is a really good list. You'll notice the endings generally stay the same. They're not particularly irregular at all. For these irregular verbs, it tends to be the stem that is the first part, which is unpredictable or doesn't follow the regular or standard pattern that we've gone through before. So I'll give you a chance to look through all of these. Other verbs will generally follow that pattern that we've gone through before, where you start with the your form of the present indicative, remove the ending, and then add the correct present subjunctive ending. Okay, now we're going to look at the imperfect subjunctive. Again, this is expected to be fairly tricky. So how can you form the imperfect subjunctive? First of all, the imperfect subjunctive is similar to the present subjunctive, but it's used instead when the verb that's in the main clause is in a past tense. For example, if you were to say, I want you to go to Spain, you'd use the present subjunctive. That first verb, I want, is in the present tense. So you'd use the present subjunctive after that. But if you were to say, I wanted you to go to Spain, the first verb, I wanted, is in a past tense now. So the second verb is also likely to go into the past subjunctive or the imperfect subjunctive rather than the present subjunctive, simply the sequence of tenses. If the first verb is in a past tense, then you're likely to use the imperfect subjunctive instead of the present subjunctive afterwards. The imperfect subjunctive can also be used in if clauses, si pudiera, for example, if I could, and various others. And there will be a video on that as well, a separate video on if clauses or si clauses. And this is how you form the imperfect subjunctive for regular verbs. So the stem, again, the first part comes from taking, well, you start with the ellos, ellas, ustedes, the they form of the preterite tense. So you need to know the preterite tense well to be able to form the imperfect subjunctive too, including irregular forms. Then you would remove the ron ending and you'd add the correct imperfect subjunctive ending instead. So these are the correct imperfect subjunctive endings. There's actually two alternatives, and both of these endings are correct. I would say that the set of endings on the left-hand side are slightly more common. These ones, so ra, ras, ra, ramos, rais, ran, those are slightly more commonly seen, but the ones on the right-hand side are also completely correct. To give examples, hablar, in the imperfect subjunctive, you would start off by finding the they form of the preterite tense, which is hablaron, which translates in English as they spoke. You take off the ron ending. That gives you the stem, which is habla. And then you'd put the correct imperfect subjunctive ending instead. If you want the I form of the imperfect subjunctive, that ending is just ra, the first one here. So that would become hablara or yo hablara in the imperfect subjunctive. And it's important to note that both sets of endings given here on the screen are actually correct and can be applied to form the imperfect subjunctive correctly. On the right-hand side, we've got an alternative set of endings, se, ses, se, semos, seis, sen. And I've used the verb comer for an example here. So comer, what is the they form of the preterite tense? It's comieron, which means they ate in English. You take away the ron ending again, and then you'd add the correct imperfect subjunctive ending instead. So the your form, if you want to form the your form, then that ending would be just the letters se, making comiese or yo comiese in the imperfect subjunctive. So both sets of endings are completely correct. You can choose either, and you would potentially need to recognize both, or be useful to be able to recognize both for GCSE and iGCSE exams. Okay, so these are just examples for regular verbs of the formation of the imperfect subjunctive. We've got hablar on the left side, that's a typical ER verb, to speak, comer, to eat in the middle, which is an ER verb, and vivir, a regular IR verb on the right-hand side, which means to live. You can see for all of this, there's two alternatives because of the two possible endings in the imperfect subjunctive. Okay, there are no actual irregular verbs as well, I should say, in the imperfect subjunctive. They should all follow that rule that we've just gone through, and that's a pattern of formation. The imperfect subjunctive is definitely in the advanced category for GCSE and iGCSE. But if you can master it, or if you're confident in being able to pull it off correctly in your exams for speaking or writing, then it can look really impressive. An alternative, though, it does exist. Some of you will definitely be glad to know. And that instead is memorizing key phrases. So if you're having trouble with the subjunctive Or if it's completely new, you've never come across it before, and you simply won't be able to memorize it or get through it before your final GCSE and iGCSE exams, what you could do instead, this is something I talk about often, is memorizing key phrases. So you could simply learn a bunch of phrases which, for example, include subjunctive forms already. And just by memorizing them, instead of memorizing how to form all of the subjunctive, when to use it, and so on, which can definitely be tricky, you could simply use your memory, memorize a handful of key phrases instead. Key phrases don't take that much extra time and effort to learn necessarily, and they can really boost your marks. So it's an excellent tactic. Subjunctive phrases are one example of key phrases. There are various other types of them out there too. But subjunctive phrases particularly tend to impress GCSE examiners and are especially valuable for the speaking and writing papers. Speaking of key phrases, this is an example of one revision resource I created. This one is actually for French, GCSE and iGCSE, which consists of a list of key phrases and a grammar checklist too, so you can track your progress and how well you know each element of French GCSE and iGCSE grammar. I'm always coming up with and creating new resources, and I have several free resources available for Spanish too, as well as other languages as well. So if you'd like to get your hands on these, they're very useful. So I highly recommend it. Don't hesitate to get in touch. If you'd like to ask any further questions on any of this or something you've seen in a different video instead, or if you'd like to inquire about more personalized help or find out about that as well, don't hesitate to contact me. This is how you can do so by email or through Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. I'm very active on those platforms. I post on all three of them every single day. So you can make a note of how to find me there too. I post about my love of languages, about why languages should be learned, why it's fun and exciting to learn different languages, how to maintain motivation during the process. But I also post a lot of content on GCSE and iGCSE exams too. How you can create a revision schedule for GCSE and iGCSE, how you can effectively learn languages and prepare for your GCSE and iGCSE exams, how to master exam technique, how to go into the exam feeling confident, and so on. So I highly recommend following me on each of those platforms. And if you'd like to inquire about group classes, one-to-one classes, both of which I offer for Spanish and other languages too, as well as any of these free resources that I've mentioned, don't hesitate to reach out.